Please note, this video is meant to be a reference only and not a detailed instructional video. There are a large amount of details that you will not see in this video that should be described to you by an instructor. Escapes require a lot of timing, details, patience, and more. Also be aware that these escapes work for specific situations and not all escapes fit all scenarios. Having a good arsenal is very important. Part 1 of this series demonstrates side control escapes, scarf hold escapes, and modified scarf hold escapes. I hope you enjoy. When you get your forearm underneath your opponent's neck, start shrimping away. If they start following you and they do not block your hips with their arm, you can then come back quickly, hook your outside leg over their leg, and catch their leg into half guard. Remember that when you do this, you also want to take your inside hand and push their leg closer towards your leg, so in that way you can make it easier to catch their leg. Another common escape when your opponent doesn't block your hips is to shrimp away and then quickly come back in and slide your knee and your shin across their body, then tilt so you can get your closed guard back. So when you're doing this, make sure you get to your side. Ideally, you either want to get your forearm under or get an underhook, shrimp away, and then slide your knee across their body so in that way you could obtain the guard back. Make sure you're on your side a bit so in that way it's easier for you to shrimp away as well. Now, if your opponent blocks your hip when you're going to shrimp away, it's going to be hard for you to get your guard back and get your shin underneath. So when you're shrimping away, when you feel them block your hip, instead of coming back, go down towards your stomach so you can get to all fours, and then that way you can start working to attack them from that position. So remember, it's a good idea to basically go away from them when they block your hips and then get to your knees instead of trying to get your shin across and trying to get your guard back. Because when you try to get your guard back when they're blocking your hips, then it's going to be much harder for you to do and you're going to waste more energy. Now, when you're doing this escape where you shrimp away and you basically belly down so you can escape, you don't always have to work to attack for a takedown and get on top. What you can do is you can also back your body up and then sit down to guard. So in this video, what I'm doing is I'm shrimping away, my opponent puts his arm on the other side of my hip, then I get the underhook, and then I sit back. You can do this whether they move their arm or not. Now, an escape that many people call the jailbreak escape, which was coined by Eddie Bravo, is a very highly effective escape, especially when you can't get the underhook on your opponent and you can't get your forearm underneath their neck as well. Basically, what you do is you turn your hips, you move your hips outward, and you grab your own foot and you pull it so it's underneath your opponent's thigh. So I hip out, I grab my own foot, put it underneath my opponent's thigh and their hip, and then I push my legs out so in that way I can get the butterfly guard. Now, sometimes your opponent will have you in side control where you have both your arms stuck underneath you and you're kind of facing away from them. When that happens, sometimes you can't turn into them, so you have to do the escape where you turn away from them. When you do this escape, it's very important that your top or near side elbow goes underneath their arm or underneath their armpit when you're turning away, so in that way you can use it to push them off of you. Also, when you do this turning away escape, if you keep your rotation, you can basically sit back down to guard. So remember, get your elbow underneath, use your elbows to push them up, roll away from them, and then keep that rotation so in that way you can sit back and get your guard back. If you see in this video, I bump them up, I get my elbow underneath, I push underneath this arm with my inside elbow, keep rotating, and then I sit back so I can get my guard back. For those who like the Granby roll and like to also go inverted, when you're doing the turn away escape, you can also basically Granby roll back into them while you end up over your shoulders. So when my arms are stuck underneath me, my only option is to turn away. So I start turning away from him. I roll over my shoulders and then I quickly drop my legs and my hips back so in that way I can recover my guard. Now, if you feel like your opponent doesn't have a super tight grip on you, you may be able to bump into them, get your hand on their armpit and start pushing them away, which makes them post their hand out. If they post their hand out that is closer to your hips or closer to your legs, you can then take your leg, put your shin on their bicep, and then create that space so then that way you can basically recover. So I put my shin there, create that space, get my other shin across, and then get to open guard. Now, when you do this movement and you bump into them and then bump back, and push their armpit, it's possible they might post with the arm that's around your head. If they do this, this is actually better for you. When this happens, post your arm on their tricep closer to the elbow, and then you can do the stiff arm escape where you stiff arm on their arm and then you start scooting backwards. So I bump into him, grab his armpit, push him over, then I stiff arm his arm and start scooting backwards so I can get out of this bad position. It's also possible for you to force this position to happen as well. When I bump up and I'm able to create that space underneath his neck, I then get both my arms underneath his shoulder and his armpit, create that space, and then I reach over, grab behind his elbow, push it over my body and start scooting out. So from this angle, you see I get my arms under, push that space, push on his elbow, and then when I'm pushing on his elbow, I make sure I keep my arm stiff. I start scooting back, and then I escape from side control. An additional situation where you can go for the stiff arm escape is when your opponent takes their arm, brings it on the other side of their head. So initially they had head control underneath, and then they bring their arm over on the other side of the head, so in that way they can maybe attack for a Kimura, a key lock, or an arm lock of sorts. And then when they do this, you reach over, grab their elbow, immediately push it away, stiff arm it away, and then scoot your body out from that space that's been created from the movements that you're doing. A common reaction that your opponent might have to this particular situation is when you go to do the stiff arm escape, they bring their elbow back. When that happens, put your hand on their shoulder instead and then start scooting backwards a little bit more in front of them. So here I go to do the stiff arm escape, but he brings his elbow back, so I switch my hand to his shoulder and scoot back. If they don't have tight pressure into your near side arm, you're able to bump in and get an underhook with your inside arm. You can then bring the arm on the other side of the ribs, shoot your body up, and basically rotate your whole body around so you can get to a turtle or a side back type attacking position. You could also attack for Bravos from here as well. And even better is if you create this space and you're able to get both your arms on the side of your opponent's body. So from here, I get my forearm underneath, I push up on his neck, get both my arms under and on the sides of his ribs, and then I do a reverse shrimp so I can come out the side, and then I'm immediately on my opponent's side and attacking his back. So if you look from the different angle, I'm able to bump, get that space, which is very important, get my arms on both sides of it, on the same side of his ribs, shuck out, and then attack from his side. A common scarf hold escape is to bump into your opponent so in that way he posts his hand that's controlling your arm. When he does this, you drop your inside arm down so in that way you get it by his hip, and when you do this, you create some space so in that way you can start attacking your opponent's back. Lots of time this is going to end up creating scramble type situations. If your opponent has his head up and he gets kind of lazy and forgets, his base and his posture, it's possible to get a frame across your opponent's neck, start walking your body out, and then get your legs over his head. So I get a frame across his neck, I start walking my body out, and I get a frame over his head, and I start pushing down on his head so I can get on top. When I push down on his head, once he starts getting down, I then release my legs so I can get to my knees and get my top control position. Another option, if you get your bridging and your leverage right, is bump your opponent's head towards the mat, and as soon as their head touches towards the mat or leans towards the mat, you immediately change directions away from them. So from here, I bump his head towards the mat, and then I cut back so I can roll him over and make him much lighter. And the similar concept is actually trying to bump him a little bit so in that way you can raise his hips up and get your near side leg as close as possible to their hips and under their hips so in that way you create leverage and make them lighter as well. So from here I bump him a little bit, get my near side leg underneath his hips, and then this gives me leverage to lift him up and then roll him over without him feeling heavy. With modified scarf hold escapes, it's very important that you get your opponent's head up. One way that I do this is by grinding my forehead into the side of my opponent's head, and then I lift his head up with my forehead. So I turn my forehead and I put it right on his temple, and then I basically crunch my head forward, which lifts his head and gives me the opportunity to get a frame. Just like the regular scarf hold escape, if your opponent isn't getting his head down or his base is a little weak, you can frame his face walk your body outward, and then throw your legs over his head and chop his body down. So from here, you'll see I frame my opponent's face, I start scooting my body out, I throw my leg over his head, chop down, so in that way I can roll him and get on top. One of my highest percentage modified scarf hold escapes is when I get near side collar control on my opponent and I drive his collar straight into his neck, basically like I'm stiff arming, and I start scooting away as hard as I can. So I take my hand, I grab his near side collar, I drive my knuckles across, start scooting away so I can create that space, and then I can get out. Lots of times you can even attack for an omoplata from this particular situation here. A modified scarf hold escape that catches people off guard is when you reach across, clamp your hands together, and pull their arm, almost like you're doing an arm crush type position, and then you get good control of their arm and start rolling through, and it is actually hard for them to pull their arm out, and you'll be surprised on how stuck your opponent gets when you're doing this, and the ability for you to roll them over from this position that is supposed to be a very dominant position for them. Thank you for watching part 1 of our Positional Escape series. We have 3 more parts to go. Please visit us at www.grapplersguide.com so that way you can get a heads up on advance notice on the upcoming series.